We now come to the statement from the Foreign Secretary. Welcome to the dispatch box, Foreign Secretary James Cleverly.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With permission, I will update the House on the situation in Ukraine. This morning, Russian missiles again struck Kyiv and other cities, destroying critical national infrastructure and depriving Ukrainians of water and electricity. Earlier today, I spoke to our ambassador in Kyiv, and I heard again of the extraordinary resilience of Ukraine's people in the face of Russian aggression. At the weekend, Russia suspended its participation in the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which has allowed the exportation of 100,000 tons of food every day, including to some of the least developed countries in the world. Putin is exacting vengeance for his military failures on the civilians of Ukraine by cutting off their power and their water supply, and on the poorest people in the world by threatening their food supplies. Over 60% of the wheat exported under the Black Sea Grain Initiative has gone to low and middle income countries, including Ethiopia, Yemen, and Afghanistan. It would be unconscionable for those lands to be made to suffer because of Putin's setbacks on the battlefield in Ukraine. I urge Russia to stop impeding this vital initiative that is helping feed the hungry across the world and agree to its extension. Meanwhile, Russia's suicide drones and cruise missiles are killing Ukrainian civilians, obliterating their homes, and even destroying a children's playground. A third of the country's power stations were put out of operation in a single week. None of this achieves any military purpose. Putin's only aim is to spread terror and to deprive Ukrainian families of shelter, light, and heat as harsh winter approaches. I'm sure the House will join me in condemning his breaches of international humanitarian law. I'm sure every honourable and right honourable member will share my conviction that Putin will never break the spirit of the Ukrainian people. And this House will share my incredulity at the glaring contradictions in Putin's thinking. He claims that Ukraine is part of Russia and that Ukrainians are Russians. But at the same time, he calls them Nazis who must be bombed without mercy. When he launched his invasion, he convinced himself that Russian forces would be welcomed in Kyiv, and they would either support him or be too craven to stand in his way. He could not have been more wrong. The last 8 months has shown the scale of his miscalculation. They have shown the barbarity of his onslaught, including the mass rape committed by Russian soldiers in Ukraine. The UK's campaign to prevent sexual violence in conflict is more urgent now than ever, and I will host a conference on this vital subject next month. And now, the Kremlin is resorting to peddling false claims, churning out invented stories that say more about the fractures within the Russian government than they do about us. It is also reprehensible that Iran should have supplied Russia with the Shahed drones that are bringing destruction to Ukraine in violation of UN Resolution 2231. On the 20th of October, the government imposed sanctions on 3 Iranian commanders involved in supplying weaponry to Russia, along with the company that manufactures Shahed drones. Earlier, Putin announced on the 30th of September that Russia had annexed 4 regions of Ukraine spanning 40,000 square miles, the biggest land grab in Europe since the Second World War. Once again, this exposes his self-delusion. Putin has declared the annexation of territory he has not captured. And what he had managed to seize, he is in the process of losing. On the 12th of October, 143 countries, 3/4 of the entire membership of the United Nations, voted in the General Assembly to condemn the annexation. Russia had just 4 supporters: Syria, Belarus, Nicaragua, North Korea. And when those regimes are your only friends, you really know that you are isolated. When 141 countries denounced Putin's invasion back in March, some speculated that that was the ceiling of the international support for Ukraine. The latest vote showed even more nations are now ready to condemn Russia. But Putin still thinks that by forcing up food and energy prices, we will lose our resolve. Our task is to prove him wrong. We will not waver in our support for Ukraine's right to self-defense. I delivered that emphatic message when I spoke to my Ukrainian counterpart on Tuesday, and my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, said the same to President Zelensky when they spoke on the phone, the first foreign leader that he called upon his appointment as Prime Minister. On Thursday, I will attend a meeting of G7 foreign ministers in Germany, where I will send a unified signal of our shared determination. This year, Britain gave Ukraine £2.3 billion worth of military support, more than any country in the world apart from the United States of America. We will provide Ukraine with more support to repair its energy infrastructure, and we have committed to £220 million of humanitarian aid. The House will have noted Putin's irresponsible talk about nuclear weapons and an absurd claim that Ukraine plans to detonate a radiological dirty bomb on its own territory. No other country is talking about nuclear use. No country is threatening Russia or threatening President Putin. He should be clear that for the UK and our allies, any use at all of nuclear weapons would fundamentally change the nature of this conflict. There would be severe consequences for Russia. And how counterproductive would it be for Russia to break a norm against nuclear use that has held since 1945 and has underpinned global security? Nothing will alter our conviction that the Ukrainians have a right to live in peace and freedom in their own lands. If Putin were to succeed, every expansionist tyrant would be emboldened to do their worst, and no country would be safe. That is why we stand and will continue to stand alongside our Ukrainian friends until the day comes, as it inevitably will, that they prevail. Mr. Speaker, I commend this statement to the House.
Shadow Foreign Secretary David Lammy.
Mr. Speaker, the war in Ukraine is at a critical new stage. Increasing missile and drone attacks, the senseless withdrawal from the grain export deal that would lead to increasing hunger around the world, and as we enter the winter months, Putin's rhetoric is becoming increasingly irresponsible, including his references to nuclear weapons and dangerous fabrications around a so-called dirty bomb. And I support the Foreign Secretary's words on that matter. This is a sign of Putin's desperation, but this does not mean an end is near. This will be a long and protracted conflict. This morning, more than 50 missiles were launched by Russian forces against Ukrainian energy and water systems over the course of just a few hours. This isn't an isolated attack, but a deliberate and callous Russian strategy to target civilian infrastructure ahead of the winter. Mr. Speaker, some estimates claim almost a third of Ukraine's power stations and other energy facilities have been hit, and 80% of Kyiv has been left without water after these latest attacks. The Foreign Secretary mentioned his discussions with our ambassador on the ground. I am sure the whole House are grateful to the embassy team for their continuing work in very challenging conditions. Can the Foreign Secretary set out today how many electricity generators the UK has already sent to Ukraine and how we will strengthen Ukraine's energy supply at this time? Some of these attacks have been conducted using Iranian-supplied drones. We welcome the sanctions already announced against the Iranian regime. What further measures is the government considering to prevent Iran's material support to Russia's invasion? Over the past week, we've also seen Russia engage in baseless, ridiculous accusations that the United Kingdom was involved in the destruction of part of the Nord Stream pipeline. What is the government doing to tackle the dangerous disinformation being spread by Putin? Mr. Speaker, the UN-backed agreement on grain exports has been vital in reducing global food prices. President Putin's unjustifiable decision to pull out of this deal will have catastrophic consequences. It comes at a time when many countries are already food insecure, including Somalia, where an imminent famine is feared. This decision should be seen by the world for what it is: the Kremlin's cruel and transparent use of hunger to blackmail. Any spike in world food prices will be the responsibility of the Russian government. An agreement must be restored. Can the Foreign Secretary outline what conversations he's had with counterparts, including Turkey, on the potential for restoring grain flows? And what steps the UK is considering to mitigate the worst consequences for the developing world if those efforts fail? Since the end of August, Ukraine has been conducting successful counter-offensive operations in the south and east of Ukraine, liberating around 12,000 square kilometres. But Russia continues to attempt to make progress in the Donbass and Bakhmut. Winter is coming. Any counter-offensives could soon slow, and an operational stalemate is likely for the next couple of months. It is day 249 of the invasion, and the Ministry of Defence has not even signed a contract to replenish the NLAW's anti-tank missiles, which has been vital to the Ukrainian army. Will the government restock and resupply Ukraine and the British Armed Forces with essential military assistance? Over 20 NATO countries have now rebooted defence plans since the invasion began, but the UK government has still not done so. Will he update the integrated review of the foreign and defence policy and continue what was indicated by the last Prime Minister? Now we are on our third in just 3 months. Mr. Speaker, last month the UN, at the United Nations, more countries than ever voted to condemn Russia in its illegal and unjustifiable annexation of Ukrainian territory. The world saw through the sham referendums and recognised Russia's actions as a flagrant violation of the UN Charter. We must sustain and grow the diplomatic coalition against Putin, because the outcome of this war will depend on who is more resilient: Putin's Russia or Ukraine and its supporters in the West and beyond. Labour is clear. We won't let our support for Ukraine falter. Our duty now is to make sure Ukraine wins. This means providing the diplomatic and military support required, but also moving beyond ad hoc announcements and laying out a long-term strategy for military, economic and diplomatic assistance through 2023 and beyond. We have to reinforce the message to Putin: continuing this barbaric war will make it worse, not better, for Russia.
Foreign Secretary.
I thank my opposite number, the Right Honourable Gentleman, for the points that he's made, and echoing from his benches the support for the Ukrainian people and their attempts to, or their work to eject Russia from their homelands. I think it is noticed that whilst we often disagree, sometime on detail, our collective response is to support the Ukrainian people. That will be noted, and I think they will be incredibly grateful for that. He raises a number of points which I will attempt to cover in my response. In terms of the energy needs of the Ukrainian people going into the winter, the UK has pledged £100 million to support Ukraine's energy security and to reform, and £74 million in fiscal grants to support Ukraine through the World Bank. With his specific question about the number of generators, I will seek to get more details of that and share those with him at an appropriate point in the future. With regard to Iran, he notes the fact that we have already sanctioned a number of people, as I made in the point I made in my statement. He will know that we do not discuss future sanctions designations, but I can assure him that we will be keeping a close eye on Iran and indeed any other country's actions in terms of providing arms for Russia, and we will take appropriate actions to dissuade them from doing so and to react if they do. He is absolutely right to highlight the situation with regard to disinformation. We have seen increasingly desperate statements coming out of the Russian Ministry of Defense and the Kremlin. Those claims are designed to distract the Russian people and indeed the wider international community from the truth. And the truth is that the Ukrainians are pushing Russian forces back on the battlefield. We must not be distracted from that truth, and he is absolutely right that we must work with our international allies to make sure that Russia's disinformation campaign does not influence global support for the Ukrainian people. He also mentioned grain exports, and I've spoken with my Turkish counterparts in the past, expressing our gratitude for the work that they've done securing that grain export deal. And we've also reinforced the need for that to be extended and for Russia to lift the pause on their engagement with that. This is about ensuring that the global poor, those people who are already suffering from hunger, are not drawn into a conflict not of their choosing. And we must not let Vladimir Putin use global hunger as leverage to undermine support for the Ukrainians in the defence of their homelands. He asks about the supply of anti-tank missile systems. We are committed to matching our support next year as we have done for this year. We will ensure that the Ukrainians are supplied with the arms most relevant to the needs at the time. Obviously, in the initial conflict, the initial phases of the conflict, those NLAWs and other anti-tank missile systems were incredibly important to them. What we're now seeing as the battlefield has evolved, ground-to-air missile systems and air-to-air missile systems have increased in importance. We'll make sure that our support to Ukraine matches their needs, but we'll also ensure that we don't denude our own armed forces of requirements, and action has been taken to stimulate the supply chain for critical military equipment. We will always ensure that we adapt to the circumstances on the ground, on the battlefield, and also ensure that we don't, as I say, denude ourselves of our ability to defend this country as well as our friends and allies.
Yeah, now come to the Chair of the Select Committee, Alicia Cairns.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Over the next month, war on the ground will be most difficult to Putin to wage, and therefore he is weaponising famine, information, sexual violence, and even Ukraine's children. So can my right honourable friend tell me what conversations he is having with abstentionist countries who are most likely to suffer from famine in order to that they encourage Russia to return to the Black Sea grain deal? On the kidnapping of Ukrainian children, which is a form of genocide, there appears to be no meaningful international action taking place, so can he reassure us on that front? And finally, Bellingcat have identified 33 individuals whose sole job is to target civilian infrastructure within Ukraine. Can he reassure us that sanctions are being considered against these individuals whose sole job is to terrorise the Ukrainian public?
Foreign Secretary.
I thank my honourable friend for the points that she has made, and she is absolutely right that it is important that we engage with those countries that have thus far abstained in votes at the United Nations to remind them that Russia's attack on Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine, is not just a European issue. It is about the UN Charter. It is about territorial integrity. It is about the rule of law. And that any and all countries that value those things should show solidarity in their condemnation of Russia's involvement. She asks about individuals that may be involved in targeting of civilian infrastructure. She will understand, of course, that we don't discuss intelligence matters, and also we don't go into detail about future sanctions designations, but I can assure her that we think very carefully, we act very carefully in terms of our response to deter but also to respond to those the issues that she has raised. And we will, of course, keep a very, very close eye on the actions of Russia, where they are targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure as well as critical national infrastructure, and that will always be an important part of the work we do.
SNP spokesperson, Anam Kesa.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Renewed cruise missile attacks on Ukrainian cities and civilian infrastructure this morning are appalling, but tragically now part of Putin's almost daily arsenal. By attacking residential areas, electricity infrastructure and water supplies, Putin is ordering his troops to carry out war crimes on a daily basis. And then, as an international community, we cannot allow this to happen. So can the Foreign Secretary give detail about what is being done to assist diplomats on the ground in Ukraine, including UK diplomats, document war crimes and crimes against humanity committed by the Russian military, so that these incidents can be escalated to the ICC. As this war morphs into a protracted conflict, the creep of Ukraine fatigue into the UK public is an increasing danger. So the statistics published recently show that in the midst of the hiked UK energy prices, UK public support for continuing economic sanctions against Russia has fallen from 73% in March to 41% in this month. So what is the UK government doing to mitigate against Ukraine fatigue? Will the UK government commit to a public campaign to remind the electorate A, why we're supporting Ukraine, and B, what they can continue doing to help? Food security is also of grave concern. 12 grain export ships have left Ukraine today, despite Russia pulling out of the Turkey-UN brokered grain deal. So the need for reliable grain supplies, Madam Deputy Speaker, particularly in regions such as the Horn of Africa, is acute. As the aggressor in this war, Russia has already made itself an international pariah, and it cannot continue to do so by actively restricting food supplies to famine and drought-affected regions of the world. So can the Foreign Secretary outline the steps that the FCDO is taking alongside international allies to get Russian officials back into talks for this deal? And will he also confirm whether UK officials are assisting Turkish counterparts in their efforts in securing this grain deal? And finally, can he give the House details about the sanctions on Iran, given their supplies of drones to Russia against Ukraine have targeted civilians? And he said in an earlier answer to the Shadow Foreign Secretary that he, quite rightly, won't give detail, but can he commit to giving regular updates to the House?
Yeah. Secretary of State.
Deputy Speaker, the Honourable Lady raises a number of very important points with regard to Iran. I can assure her that we constantly review our sanctions policy, our sanctions designations, and we will ensure that we respond to any further breaches of the UN Security Council resolution about supplying arms to this conflict. She makes an incredibly important point about the documentation of war crimes. I had meetings with Karim Khan, head of the International Criminal Court, the Chief Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, with regard to documentation of war crimes to ensure that those perpetrators know that they will be held to account for the actions that they have taken. And with regards to the UK's support for Ukraine, we recognise that this winter will be tough for people here in the UK. Our energy support package is designed to alleviate some of that pressure, but we recognise it will be tough. But I think the British people instinctively understand that if we slip back from our support of the Ukrainians in this incredibly difficult time for them, the costs globally will be huge. The cost in lives, the cost in food supplies, the cost in energy supplies, and the costs to families here in the UK. So as difficult as it is, and I recognise that it is difficult for everyone at this time, it is essential that we continue our support for Ukraine, because the costs of inaction will be so much higher.
Vicky Ford. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Tens of thousands of people have been affected by this war directly, and thousands of Ukrainian innocent civilians have lost their lives. It's absolutely right that the UK remains steadfast and unwavering in our support for the people of Ukraine. We will be with them as long as they need us. But globally, as my right honourable friend Foreign Secretary said, many millions of the world's most vulnerable have been pushed deeper into hunger and starvation and even famine by Putin's war on food. I was very pleased to hear my right honourable friends reminding of the fact that the majority of the grain that has come out of the Black Sea has gone to low and middle income countries, because Russian misinformation is trying to tell the world the opposite. So can I urge my right honourable friend and his team of excellent ministers to use all diplomatic tools to try and get that Black Sea grain initiative not only back up and running, but also extended, and to continue to call out the Russian misinformation on this point.
Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to put on record my thanks to my right honourable friend for the work that she did in her time at the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, and the huge energy that she brought to the role. She's absolutely right that we are witnessing the perverse situation where Vladimir Putin is trying to impose even greater hunger on people who are already suffering food insecurity and in some instances famine. It is absolutely wrong that he does so, and we call upon Russia to resume the Black Sea grain deal and to extend it. It is deeply, deeply wrong that the world's poor are forced to suffer even more because Russia has been and is being unsuccessful on the battlefield, and I can assure her that we will continue working with Turkey and others to get that deal back in place.
Yeah. Keep track of using government. Chris Bryant, you said.
Chris Bryant.
One of the most depressing things, upsetting things I've seen in the last few days is Russian conscripts in floods of tears saying, I don't want to be cannon fodder, I'm just going to be cannon fodder. So this is a crime against Russian people as well.
Yeah.
But can I just ask about the sanction regime in the UK? Because it does seem a bit of an own goal and counterproductive. If significant people who are being sanctioned by the UK are allowed to have £60,000 a month, £1.5 million to spend on luxurious lifestyles here. And can you just update us on what's happened to the £3.5 billion from Abramovich's sale of Chelsea, which was meant to be going already by now to the reconstruction of Ukraine?
Yeah. Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, I can assure the honourable gentleman that we will continue to work with our international counterparts to make sure that our sanctions are effective as they can be, and to continue putting pressure on those people who are funding Russia's illegal and unprovoked war in Ukraine. I will seek to get further details on the specific points that he has raised with regard to sanctions. He's absolutely right. He is absolutely right that in addition to the terrible suffering that Ukrainians are experiencing because of Putin's invasion of Ukraine, Russians are also suffering. There are mothers who thought their sons were going to a training exercise who now have found out that those soldiers have been killed on the battlefield. Putin has blood on his hands, Ukrainian blood, Russian blood. It is down to him and almost no one else.
Julian Lewis.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Given the emphasis that Putin is putting on attacking infrastructure, and without in any way asking him to be specific, will the Foreign Secretary reassure the House that enough attention is being paid by our armed forces to protecting undersea pipelines and internet cables, and will he have a quiet word between now and the autumn statement with the Prime Minister and the Chancellor to say that now is not the right time to be rowing back from a long overdue promise to increase expenditure on defence?
Secretary of State.
My right honourable friend tempts me to go beyond my brief at the dispatch box. All I can say is that I always listen to his advice carefully, and I have no doubt that the Secretary of State for Defence, the Prime Minister and indeed the Chancellor will have all listened very, very carefully to the points he put forward.
Tony Lloyd.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the Minister, the Foreign Secretary has quite rightly made the point about protection of the infrastructure in Ukraine, because we know the campaign at the moment is to weaken the morale of the Ukrainian people. Is he satisfied, though, in that context, that there is the international coordination so that we're making sure that the British efforts from other international partners are such that it does deliver the support that Ukraine needs at the moment?
Secretary of State.
He makes a very important point. Vladimir Putin clearly went into this conflict believing that the pressure he exerted on Ukraine would create fragmentation in the Ukrainian political system. It did not. He was expecting it would create tension in NATO. It did not. He thought it would split up the EU. It did not. He thought it would break up the G7. It did not. At every single strategic aim, he has failed. Indeed, he is now looking at a stronger and larger NATO because of his actions. I can assure the honourable gentleman that the international community, if anything, has been brought closer together in terms of our coordinated response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine and in terms of our support to the Ukrainians themselves.
Sir John Whittingdale.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can my right honourable friend make clear that if indeed any attack did take place on the Russian Black Sea Fleet, the UK had absolutely no involvement in it? And can he confirm that despite the withdrawal of Russia from the agreement, nevertheless ships have left Odessa today bearing grain, and can he say whether or not he expects that to continue?
Secretary of State.
My right honourable friend makes a very, very important point about the importance of the Black Sea grain deal. That is helping feed people that need the international support now more than ever. With regard to the claims that are being made from the Kremlin and the Russian Ministry of Defence, they are becoming increasingly detached from reality. And as I've said, they are designed to distract the Russian people from the reality of the Russian failures on the battlefield. We will continue to shine a light on those failures, and we will continue to support Ukraine in defending itself against that aggression.
Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. In announcing it was pulling out of the deal, Russia said it would be risky for Ukraine to continue to seek to export grain using the Black Sea. Given that the only possible risk to ships comes from Russia itself, and further to the question just put by the right honourable member for Malden, if ships are moving out of Odessa, there are reports that the United Nations, Turkey and Ukraine have reached some agreement about ships that are currently in Turkish waters. Does he think there's any prospect that President Putin's bluff on this will be called? Ships will continue to be inspected by the other parties to the agreement, and they can carry on helping to feed the world.
Secretary of State.
I think the point he made about where the only credible threat to international shipping would come from is an important one. And I think the world would see, if those grain ships were attacked or if they were prevented from exporting that grain, the world would see who was ultimately responsible for imposing even further hunger on those people in the world, those people in the global south, those people already suffering from food insecurity and famine. The world would see who was truly to blame for imposing greater hardship on those people who are already suffering.
Tobias Elwood.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I absolutely endorse the support that this government, the front bench, is giving to Ukraine. But we've entered a darker chapter as Putin is up against the wall. He's resorting to non-conventional means. Can I suggest that our support, therefore, needs to move, bearing in mind the escalatory ladder, from the battlefield to supporting Ukraine's infrastructure. And to that end, Odessa, that critical port, those grain ships are not getting out to the scale that we need to feed the world. Could I suggest that he goes to the United Nations General Assembly, secures a resolution to create a safe haven around that port so Britain can lead the international community in maritime flotilla to support the grain ships departing and entering that port?
Secretary of State.
My right honourable friend makes an incredibly important point about the significance of grain exports from the Black Sea. I've listened to his proposal. I think that what we need to do is see Russia immediately reverse its pause on its involvement in Black Sea exports, and we will look at any options which increase the flow of food to the global south, to the people who need that food more than ever. Of course, I will take his suggestion seriously, but ultimately we want to do whatever we can do to increase the grain exports immediately.
Gavin Robinson.
Speaker, and can I thank the Foreign Secretary for his statement and in recognising the answers he has given already about sanctions for the IRGC, encourage him to recognise that across the House there will be support for further action should he deem it fit to take, and I would encourage him to do so. In respect of the United Nations, I think it is encouraging to hear that the UN are standing by ship movements today, but could he elaborate from a diplomatic perspective what avenues are available through the United Nations to increase international support, bearing in mind the veto that Russia continues to have in the P5?
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, he makes an incredibly important point about the inbuilt limitations of the United Nations because of Russia's abuse of its veto. The United Nations is an incredibly important institution, and as I say, the world, 143 countries voting in condemnation of annexation, 141 voting in condemnation of the attack. We know the United Nations is still an incredibly important institution, but Russia's veto limits to some extent what it can do. So therefore we will continue to work with the UN, with Turkey and others to maximise the grain exports through the Black Sea so we can alleviate the hunger felt by the global south.
James Sunderland.
Speaker, thank you. I'm sure that every person in the House today will share my own horror and revulsion at the continual targeting by Russia of non-combatants and also lobbing of missiles into civilian areas. Noting the limitations indirectly posed by Article 5, could the Foreign Secretary please confirm whether any consideration has been given to the deployment of an Iron Dome or Patriot-type system to protect Ukrainians?
Secretary of State.
The UK and our international allies have provided Ukraine with both ground-to-air defence systems and also air-to-air defence systems. We will continue to assess their defence needs and adjust our support to them accordingly.
Geraint Davies.
Yes, Madam Deputy Speaker, President Zelensky at the Council of Europe, which I'm a member of, suggested that they only had about 10% of the air defences needed to respond to the current onslaught. And a lot of that onslaught is, of course, from Iranian drones. So given that Iran is in a condition of social unrest, what efforts is the UK government making to ensure that people in Iran know that the focus of their government is to send weapons of mass destruction against innocent people rather than feeding them bread and giving them human rights in order to choke off over time the supply of these deadly weapons?
He makes a very good point. We will continue to take action which discourage the supply of weapons to Russia that will be used, that might be used in Ukraine, and we will keep under constant review our sanctions packages to choke off the supply of weapons like drones. We'll keep that under review.
Wendy Morton.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. My right honourable friend has set out what he is doing to urge allies and other countries to provide extra support for Ukraine, but specifically when it comes to the training of those brave Ukrainians are fighting in their homelands. I wondered if he could set out what more we can do, perhaps working with our NATO allies in this regard.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm very proud that I'm joined on the front bench by my Right Honourable and gallant friend from the Ministry of Defence. I'm incredibly proud of the work that the British Armed Forces have done training members of the Ukrainian Armed Forces. We are being joined by an increasingly large number of international allies who are doing likewise. I think it is being demonstrated on the battlefield that it's not just the equipment that we have supplied or the inherent resolve of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, but also the technical improvement that we have helped train with the Ukrainian Armed Forces that has been decisive, and I have no doubt that will continue.
Leila Moran.
Deputy Speaker, may I thank the Foreign Secretary for his words and particularly agree with when he says we will not allow Putin to use hunger as global leverage, because doing so is barbaric and frankly condemns thousands more to death than he's already killed. But given that backdrop, does he also share my concern that we as a country are now only spending 0.3% of gross national income on aid across the world? We found this out this weekend. We have all here campaigned on manifestos of 0.7%. Surely the answer now is for us to step up again and ensure that what Putin wants to do cannot be done, because we will be there to ensure that his barbaric act won't have the effect he hopes.
I don't agree with the figures that the Honourable Lady has used, but the broader fact is that we continue to support countries in the global south, poor countries around the world. We continue to support them directly, but also through ensuring that those grain exports continue. We are helping them through the Black Sea grain initiative, and I can assure her and the House that we will continue to do both. It is incredibly important that we re-establish the principle that powerful neighbours cannot invade another country with impunity, that territorial integrity must be preserved, because it will be the very people that she makes reference to in other parts of the world that would suffer if the message is sent to potential aggressors that we will stand idly by and watch them brutalise their neighbours. We will never do that.
Order. Just before we proceed, a great many people still wish to participate in this statement, and we've already been underway for 42 minutes. There's a lot of other business that the House has to transact for the rest of today, so can I make a plea for short questions, which would then allow the Foreign Secretary to give short answers? John Hull.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Will my right honourable friend join me in congratulating President Zelensky for engaging directly with parliamentarians such as myself at the Council of Europe? And he spoke openly about his needs there, and it was an answer to a question of mine that he said that the need for missile defence systems was, well, he had only 10% of what he needed.
Well, I do congratulate President Zelensky on his engagement with partners both bilaterally and multilaterally, and I would like to put on record my thanks for the work that my honourable friend does in ensuring that these issues are brought to the attention, and the huge amount of effort that he puts into the UK's position on the Council of Europe.
Alice McGovern.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Foreign Secretary's statement mentions Syria as one of those countries at the United Nations that has given Russia comfort. But it's not Syrian civilians that have taken that stance. In fact, Madam Deputy Speaker, they are the very people who know, equally to anyone in this world, of Putin's violence. So can I ask the Foreign Secretary what he's doing at the United Nations or elsewhere to widen the consensus that all civilians in our world deserve protection from Putin's violence, including Syrian civilians?
Madam Deputy Speaker, she makes an incredibly important point. We have seen the leadership in Russia, Putin bringing pain and harm on Russian people. We have seen Assad bringing pain and harm on Syrian people. We know it is not done in their name, it is not done with their say-so. And she's absolutely right that civilians around the world are suffering because of the poor decisions of their brutal leadership, both in Moscow and in Syria.
Richard Drax.
Madam Deputy Speaker, can I welcome my honourable friend to his place? I'm delighted to see he's still there. Understandably, we hear an awful lot about what we and what the Americans are giving in direct help to the Ukrainians. Can you clarify to the House exactly what other NATO countries like Germany and France are actually giving to Ukraine and the scale of it?
Madam Deputy Speaker, time prevents me from going into the level of detail that my honourable friend has asked for, but I would reassure the House that whilst the UK is second only to the United States of America in direct military support, other countries around the world, around Europe, are very, very much providing support to Ukraine and have responded with alacrity at the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Both through NATO and through various institutions, including the G7, we have become closer as allies, and we will, I'm sure, continue to stand in solidarity in our support for the Ukrainians in the defence of their homeland.
Mohammed Yassin.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. My constituents, Georgie, like many refugees supported by the Homes for Ukraine scheme, arrived in the UK with their Ukrainian cards, and they hope to return home as soon as it is safe to do so. Will the Foreign Secretary speak to his colleagues in DFT about the urgently dropping or extending the requirements to exchange Ukrainian number plates for UK plates beyond the current 6 months period, which is causing unnecessary stress to those affected?
I'll take a note of the point that he has made, and I'm sure my colleagues in Transport will have done so also.
Andrew Salou.
Will the Foreign Secretary impose sanctions on Ivan Ryabov, a Russian security official who was shown to have abused Russian females protesting against Ukraine? And would this not show that our sanctions reach reaches even junior Russians who abuse Russian protesters like that?
I'm sure he will be unsurprised to say that we don't discuss future sanctions designations, but the House and my department will have heard the name that he has mentioned and the circumstances under which that sanction might be considered.
Kevin Jones.
Madam Deputy Speaker, can I thank the Foreign Secretary for his statement. He mentioned in his statement NLAW, which has been tremendously effective in Ukraine, but it is also a fact that we haven't yet put in a contract for renewal in just the stocks for the UK Army, but also for any future use in Ukraine. Why is that, and when will the contract be signed?
My understanding is that we've given letters of comfort to the supply chain of NLAWs, which will stimulate the future production, and that we will, of course, always take actions that ensures that not only we are able to support the Ukrainians in the defence of their homeland, but we do so without detrimenting our ability to defend ourselves.
Dr. Luke Evans.
Speaking, the UN estimates suggest that the Black Sea Grain Initiative has indirectly saved 100 million people from falling into extreme poverty. So when he goes to the G7 meeting on Thursday, will he be raising this particular topic and looking at what support we can put into the key partner of Turkey to try and make sure that Russia release their suspension of this deal?
I speak with my Turkish counterpart regularly on this issue and others. They are, I know, very committed to ensure that those grain exports continue, and I will continue discussing with them how we can ensure that continues beyond the current lifestyle of this agreement.
Alison Thulis.
Madam Deputy Speaker, Russian missile strikes in Kyiv have reportedly left much of the city without a water supply. So can I ask the Secretary of State what more his government is doing to ensure Ukrainians get access to clean water, both through expertise and funding?
The Honourable Lady makes an incredibly important point about the ability to repair infrastructure. As I say, I spoke to His Majesty's Ambassador in Kiev just this afternoon about the speed with which Ukrainian municipal workers are repairing that infrastructure, remarkable speed with which they do that. Actually, I might take this opportunity to respond to a specific question that the Right Honourable Gentleman made about humanitarian assistance, including 856 portable generators to support power for essential public services in Ukraine.
Robert Coates.
Speaker. I'd like to pay tribute to the extraordinary achievements of the Ukrainian Air Force in the circumstances that they are in. Could the Foreign Secretary assure me that he will be given consideration to what support he can give them so the aerial dimension is not forgotten?
I can assure him we will consider that. I'm very proud of the fact that we've supplied a number of AMRAAM missiles specifically to help defend themselves, the Ukrainians defend themselves against attacks from the air. We'll keep that constantly under review.
Richard Ford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In a statement issued in March, the government said it had created an electricity network support task force for Ukraine, which brought together UK commercial suppliers and the Energy Networks Association. The then Foreign Secretary and Right Honourable Member for South West Norfolk said, "We will keep the lights on in Ukraine." And I thank the Right Honourable Secretary of State for talking about 856 mobile generators, but I wonder, can he update the House on what part the Electricity Network Support Task Force is now having so that we can honour the former Foreign Secretary's pledge?
Well, we continue to work with the Ukrainians to help them keep the lights on, to help them keep their water going, and not just in the here and now, but also to help their energy resilience in the future. As I say, we will ensure that our support to Ukraine adapts to account for their changing needs and circumstances.
Mark Pritchard.
Speaker, is it not the case that Putin's weaponization of food should be a wake-up call for those African countries, many of them Commonwealth countries, that have perhaps inadvertently bought into the false narrative of Putin over the war and recently abstained rather than voted for the UN resolution, and they should understand that Russia and Putin are an unreliable partner for Africa?
The whole world, including Commonwealth nations, our friends in Africa and other parts of the global south, should recognise that Vladimir Putin is no friend of theirs. He is using their hunger as leverage in his war against the Ukrainians, and they should be able to see what is happening. We will continue to help get grain out of Ukraine to help them put food on their tables.
Jim Shannon.
Madam Deputy Speaker, can I thank the Secretary of State, Foreign Secretary, very much for his statement and for his answers. And also can I particularly thank him for the £220 million of humanitarian aid, which I think is incredibly important. But with special reference to the humanitarian aid passage, can the Foreign Secretary confirm that there are still corridors where medical supplies and goods and supplies are still reaching those innocent people caught in the midst of Putin's despicable criminal attacks?
Madam Deputy Speaker, the honourable gentleman makes an incredibly important point. As well as putting the money on the table, we have to make sure that our support gets to the people that need it. We will constantly look at ways of ensuring that is the case. He will understand that I will refrain from going into details about the aid corridors that are currently in place.
Kevin Foster.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As the Foreign Secretary will know, the attack in February was not the first invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and they've been occupying illegally territory for the last 8 years, including the Crimea. Therefore, is he clear in his own mind that any strikes on Crimean territory, in particular on Sebastopol naval facilities, is a strike on Ukrainian territory, not on Russian territory?
My right honourable friend makes an incredibly important point. This conflict did not start in February. The most recent phase of this conflict started in February, but there have been Ukrainians who have been attacked, abused and occupied by Russian forces for many, many years before that. We must never lose sight of that fact.
Henry Smith.
Deputy Speaker, my right honourable friend spoke about Iran supplying drones to Russia to attack Ukrainians. Can he say a little bit more about the implications that has on the nuclear deal that we have with Iran, the world has with Iran?
He raises an important point, but it is fundamentally a separate issue. Our resolve to and in the international resolve to prevent further nuclear proliferation remains unchanged. We will continue working with our allies to ensure that Iran does not acquire a nuclear weapon, but we will also ensure that we prevent Iran and indeed anyone else from exporting arms to Russia that are being used in this conflict in Ukraine.
Saki Bhatt.
Madam Deputy Speaker, it's incredibly worrying that Iran is undermining the Ukrainian defence and putting Ukrainian civilians at risk by supplying Russia with Shahed drones. I understand that we've sanctioned 3 Iranian commanders, but can my right honourable friend confirm that he and the Prime Minister are willing to go further if needed, and he'll be raising the issue when he meets his counterparts at the G7 this Thursday?
I can assure my right honourable friend that we will continue to keep our sanctions package under review. We will respond to any further breaches of the United Nations Security Council resolutions, and that we will ensure that the message is sent that those people and those companies that are supplying arms to Russia in breach of UN Security Council resolutions will be responded to.
Finally, Brandon Clark-Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I say how truly astounded I am at the bravery of the tens of thousands of Ukrainians who have stepped up to defend their homeland. And can my right honourable friend assure me that the UK is doing all it can with its allies to make sure that they receive the necessary training for them to be able to do their jobs?
Madam Deputy Speaker, at the beginning of the year at the United Nations, I said the Ukrainians would defend their homeland ferociously. They have done exactly that. My respect for those people, both the professional soldiers, air personnel, sailors in the Ukrainian armed forces before the invasion, and those who teachers, builders, catwalk models, former politicians who have taken up arms to defend their country, have the most enormous respect from across the world. I can assure my honourable friend that we will continue to support them as they defend themselves against this illegal, unprovoked and barbaric invasion.
Thank you. That concludes the